Hi, welcome to the Joi of Sewing. I'm fashion sewer Joi Mahon, and I am really excited to share with you some information about sewing patterns. And this is one area of sewing I think that really intrigues me. I'm a pattern maker myself, but I've always been drawn to these little things right here, commercial sewing patterns. There are many different brands of patterns that you can use in sewing. There are the big four, which would be your McCall, Simplicity, Butterick, and Vogue. You're gonna run into those at most of your fabric stores. The big box stores will have a big cabinet. They'll have big chunky catalogs where you can sit down and flip through the pages and see all the patterns that you can purchase. There are also independent pattern designers, and you can find these all over the place in the sewing world. So just know that there are going to be all kinds of patterns available to you. The one little thing I want to just suggest is that maybe read a couple reviews on any pattern that you choose, more so when it comes to independent patterns, because some patterns give really great instructions, others don't give quite as thorough instructions, which may or may not be a bad thing depending on your skill level. So just be aware of that and ask some of your sewing friends or local sewing guild if they recommend a certain brand of pattern. But I have always loved these ever since I was a small child. I have all kinds of vintage patterns from a long, long time ago in my grandma's sewing stash and my mom's. And even as I was growing up and learning to sew, we could order these through our school at a discounted price. And I would get like 10 or 20 of them at a time and just open them up. Even if I never sewed them, I would just read the instructions, which is also a great tip on how to learn to sew. But let's go ahead and talk about what all comes in a pattern when you purchase it. When you go to either in the mail, you can also order these online if you don't have a store close to you. So just know you can reference these on any brand of pattern on their websites. But when you get your pattern, it's going to come in a really nice envelope like this. Once you take your pattern back out, it's really hard to get it back in here really nice, but it looks really great when you first get your pattern. And we're going to just walk through what everything means. The front of your pattern is going to have normally a photograph of the finished garment. Let's just look here at a couple that I have here. Now, these happen to be actual patterns that I designed. I have the huge privilege of being able to create patterns for McCall's Patterns, which is like a dream come true. But they all have an actual garment that has been made out of the pattern that I designed. Some patterns will also have an illustration or a sketch with some other design ideas. Now, the thing you need to know about the sketch and the photo on the front is that these are suggested ideas for color and fabrics. Please don't feel that you have to make the exact fabric combination that's on the cover of your pattern envelope. That's where you can be the designer and create your own design. You're going to have the size of the pattern down the side, and we'll put a couple of these here so you can see. This one's a 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and this one's a 14 up through a size 22. The thing you need to understand about pattern sizing is that these are not ready to wear sizing or measurements similar to just going to the store and buying something off the rack. It's not uncommon to be a size larger or a couple size larger in a commercial pattern than a garment you might buy off the rack. So for example, if you wear a size 10 dress, if you were to go to the store, you might be a 14 or a 16 in a commercial pattern. It's not a big deal. The thing about pattern sizing is that it's just a label or a name given to a set of measurements. Most likely you're going to be slightly different than the measurements anyway, so don't worry about that. Okay, so this pattern, we know our size and then the pattern number. That's really important in case you need to purchase another pattern or just so that you can reference what you made. And in my case, post pictures on my website of what you made. I love to see that. Okay, we're going to flip the pattern envelope over, and before we go through all of that information, we are going to look at this little tab. Matter of fact, let me flip that over so we can look at the tab or the flap on the pattern. If you're looking through a big pattern catalog at your store, it's going to have some of these numbers for you, but this relates to the size of the pattern. Normally, patterns are measured by your full bust, your full waist, and then your full hips. So you can go over to the chart and reference, and it's real teeny tiny here, but it says bust, waist, and hips. There's also a length on the back. If you were to go on your back and measure down to your waist, that reference point is there. So you can go over here and let's say, for example, and this is a size 6, 8, 10, 12. Let's say, for example, your bust is 36 inches and your waist is 28 and your hips are 38. You would buy a size 14 in your pattern. Now, I recommend, because most of the time you're not going to match your pattern exactly. So any garment that's going to fit the upper body, I recommend, and this is just a Joyism, but to buy your pattern for the full bust measurement. Some patterns will have you buy for the upper chest, but when I teach fit, I really revolve everything around the full bust. So that's just how I recommend doing it. If you're making a skirt or something for the lower body where it's not covering the bust, then you would buy for your full hips. Okay, let's go ahead and look at the other markings that are on the back of our pattern. Another reference or good visual to get an idea of exactly what this garment looks like are the technical flats, or these little line drawings that are on the back of your pattern. Those are really, really fun to make and do, but they're also meant to give you a pretty realistic look at the dynamics of the pattern. If I flip this back over, we have the photograph, which also is going to give us a really good idea, and a sketch, but sometimes a photograph can be stylized if a model happens to be moving, or if an illustration happens to be very elongated, but the dress maybe is really short. So these technical flats really give us a pretty literal idea of what the pattern pieces look like when they're sewn together. It tells you a lot about the design, because you can see that the skirt bottom is nice and flowy, so it's meant to be very full. You can see the gathers at the waistline. In a previous episode, we talked about darts and pleats and gathers and all of that. This is where it comes into actual application. So we can see that there are lots of gathers in this skirt. You can also tell where the seam lines are on the top of the dress. There's a seam that goes up through the princess line, or the bust point, and we also can obviously see that it has no sleeves and it just has a strap on it. So that's going to be a really good read on your design. Half of the pattern is in another language, so if you speak that language and you want to read that, go ahead. Otherwise, you can literally cover that up, and we're just going to look at the markings on this side of the pattern. And it's going to give us a lot of information. At the top of it, it's going to give us kind of an idea of the fit. This says the Missy's dress is close fitting through the bodice. It's interlined, so it has that lining in it. We talked about that in our fabric lesson. And let's see here. The bodice has a full skirt, and then it has a scalloped lace overlay. This fit, for example, says close fitting. If you're a person who thinks, oh, I don't like really tight fitting, then you would know going into this pattern, you're probably going to want to add extra so that it's not close fitting. So you can adjust the amount of fit as well. Okay, your next thing is going to be suggested fabrics, and they're suggested. If you followed our fabric lesson, we kind of talked about picking different fabrics. If you're a new sewer, you might not want to make this out of a really slinky fabric. You're probably going to want something with a little more shape and stability so that you can successfully make this and not have a headache with a fabric that you've never sewn before. This fabric is a taffeta, which is a special occasion fabric, but I have no problem for beginner sewers using that. It has a shantung satin, a dupioni, which has kind of some lines in it, and then it says a single edge scallop lace, and then it tells you things like your interlining, netting, and lining fabric. And then you're going to want to just make sure that you pick the right view. So this pattern has a view A and a view B. And really the only difference is that view B has lace over top of it. So if you're thinking, hey, I like that, look at that, but I don't want the lace, then you can omit the lace and you'll be making view A. that makes that pretty easy. Okay, down here to the size, we used, I think, a 14 as our example. So if you were going to make this pattern and you were a size 14, we're going to go over and read where the fabric width is. In our fabric lesson, we learned that fabric comes in 44 to 45 or about 60 inches wide. So, and this is a garment, so most of the time they're going to be 60 inches wide. So if you were making view A, you would go 60 inches and follow that over. You need about 9 yards of fabric. So it's a big dress, so it definitely needs some yardage. And then you're going to have underlining. It's going to tell you need a 1/2 yard. And then your notions. And you can just go through. View A requires a zipper, a hook and eye, and then some horsehair, which is just a special thing that you put in the hem. And you can ask your local fabric store for that or go online. And then there are some finished garment measurements. So this is going to give you an idea how long something is. So you can kind of take your tape measure and measure maybe a length on yourself and then compare it to your pattern and see how that's going to look on you. So lots of information there, really important, but that's going to help you ensure that you have sewing success. Let's take a look at the pattern envelope on the inside. You're going to pull out your pattern instructions. We'll set that aside. And for new seasoned sewers, sometimes we skip over some of this information, but if you're a new sewer, there's a lot of things in here that really help you. And I just want to point out on my patterns that I do for McCall's, I do a designer studio, which is kind of unique to me, and it just has some bulleted list of some ideas of different things that you can do to change up the pattern and really make it you. All right, so inside your pattern, you're going to have those technical flats or those sketches again. And then I also have some pattern fitting tips. You're really going to want to reference this if you're using one of my patterns because this really is some basic fitting tips that I share. One thing about sewing patterns is that it is a guide or a starting point for making your project. And this is really important because a lot of new sewers are often, this is information that's omitted when you learn to sew. It's very difficult to take a pattern, cut it out, sew it up right out of the envelope and achieve a perfect fit. It's meant to be a guide, but sometimes you need to modify or adjust the fit of your pattern before you start sewing. So please just know that these little hints and tips right here are going to give you some of that information. All right, how to adjust your pattern, anything you need to do on the torso. All right, let's flip this over. The other thing on your cutting guide and your pattern guide is going to provide just some basic information as to what marks on your patterns might mean, the picture of the pattern pieces. There's a lot of basic rectangle shapes in here. They're all numbered. So if you go to make your dress A or B, you can reference the list and make sure you get every pattern piece that goes with either A or B, whatever style you're making. And then you're going to have a pattern layout. And because this is a large dress, it is bigger pieces, although they're very easy shapes. This is not a hard design. It's just they are a little bigger. If you think that might be too bulky for you, then maybe make a shorter version to begin with. But here the layout has what the fabric would be on the table and then what your pattern pieces would look like if you laid them out. And every pattern has that. It's a guide. Just know that if your fabric is a little different, you can modify a little bit how you lay your pattern pieces out. And finally, you're going to have a few pages of instructions, and we won't go through all of these, but basically they start with, you find what dress. This one says dress A and B. So for here, you're going to, regardless of what you're making, you're going to start on step 1, and then you're going to go to step 2. And there's always an illustration and kind of a step outs on what it looks like when you're sewing your dress together. Let's take a look at what our pattern actually looks like out of the envelope. Now, this actually goes to a different garment because I made this for myself just the other night. But this is a really great illustration of what a pattern looks like once it's cut out, because the pattern pieces that are in these envelopes are tissue paper. You can press them if you would like. I usually fold them back up and stick them back in the envelope and save them in case I want to make that again for myself. But there's going to be different markings on the pattern. So let's take a look at what these reference lines are. And not really any particular order, but your pattern is going to have the name of the company, and then it's going to have the pattern number on it and the size. This is important because if you have a whole bunch of pattern pieces and you don't know what goes where, you can check the pattern number so that you put the right, say, sleeve with the right jacket and whatnot. The pattern pieces are going to be numbered. So when you're looking at your pattern layout guide that we just looked at and it says take piece number 1, that is clearly marked on your pattern. The pattern will also tell us that it's a front or a back or a sleeve or a skirt, and then it's going to tell you how many to cut. And this says cut 2. All right, there are some reference points on our pattern. Let's go ahead and start with the grain because that's a really important one. Your grain is always indicated with a straight vertical line and a little arrow at the bottom. Or if you have a garment that's cut on the fold, then you might have that closer to the edge of the pattern and it will say cut on the fold. This is really important, and I hadn't intended it, but I have a striped fabric right here. If I was laying out this pattern on this striped fabric, I would want that grain to match the stripe on the fabric, so that way my garment would hang straight up and down. We have a center front line here. We have, what is this? That's a dart. If you watched our dart and tuck lessons, this is a practical application. This is the actual dart on the pattern. We would use our tracing paper to mark that out. And the little dots on the dart, you should bring those together. Let me just kind of do that with my hands here to illustrate that. And then that would form the dart. So as you're marking, putting these marks onto your actual fabric, you would do it on the back side of your fabric, but these are all little tools to help make sure that you form the correct placed dart and that it has the right shape. There's a bust dart on our pattern. Now this pattern has multiple sizes on it. So we have a cutting line, and then we also have a graded dart line here. So if we're making the 14, we are going to go find the, and this one's actually a larger size, but we're going to find the 14 size, and then we're going to cut on that line. But let's say you're a 16. So then you would actually cut on that 16 line, and if you marked your dart, then you would use the lines that have that mark on there. So just, be aware of any of those lines that are unique to the size of the pattern that you're using. The last few things on the pattern are notches, and that's these little triangle shaped things right here. Now normally when you're cutting a notch, you're actually going to cut a little peak in your fabric. So if I were to take, let's grab our scissors here. If I were to cut this out, I would stop at the notch, and then I would angle my scissors outward and inward and then cut around. That's one way to mark your notch. I have a little notcher in my studio, so sometimes I put a little nick in my fabric instead. You can clip there as long as your fabric isn't one that is going to shed or fray if you do that. Some people put a little dot there with their marking pin. So whatever makes sense to you, you can mark that. But those are reference points for joining pieces together. Single knots, or notches usually indicate the front of a garment. Double notches, let's unfold this, as in the side, would indicate the side seam. Sometimes you're going to run into a triple notch, which usually is like a center back or a center front, that sort of thing. So those are really important pieces of the puzzle. And then we've got little dots. Dots are also key areas of a pattern. I know that this is a jacket pattern, and that dot is actually a placement line. So when I put the collar to the actual garment, I match the dots on the collar with the dots on the body of the fabric, and then they go together perfectly. And lastly, this little round indicator right here is an apex line, and that's really, really important. I put that in all of my patterns because, like I said, when I measure for the full body, because we build everything in pattern making revolves around the apex when you're making patterns. And so that's really a stationary point of measurement. I think that's really most of the things that you're going to run into. There'll be other things like a lengthen and shorten line, maybe a hemming line, and some other reference points. So just read your pattern. Once you've done a few garments, you're going to start recognizing these, and it's not going to all seem quite so new. But pay attention and transfer any of these markings to the back side of your fabric. Because once you get to sewing your garment, you're going to take your pattern, you might keep it, but it's not going to be there anymore. So all the information on here needs to be on your fabric. Let's talk about actually cutting our garment out. Now, we talked in our fabric lesson, check out that episode, about the salvage edge. And I have this fabric folded right here, but you can see that it has a frayed edge. But that is the salvage. This also the strongest direction of the fabric and the weave. And of course, it runs parallel to the stripes that are in. And this is a beautiful, beautiful cotton fabric, a very nice quality. It's very on grain, which means that the stripes are going straight up and down. They're not cockeyed. It's just a really great fabric. So when I lay my pattern piece out, I have the grain line marked on my pattern. I want that to run parallel to the salvage edge. And it's pretty easy to do on this stripe fabric because it's so on grain. I literally can just line up a stripe on there and know that it's going to hang straight. But on a lot of fabrics, what you're going to need to do is you're going to want to put a pin. Well, let's grab a pin over here. And we're going to want to put a pin on one side of the grain. And then we're going to measure from the very edge of the salvage over to the pin. You can do this with one of those hemming gauges as well because you can adjust your placement and then you'll have that right where it needs to be. But I'm just going to put my hand here and then you're going to go down here and you're going to measure that same distance to the edge. Now I can tell I need to straighten that out just a little bit. And normally I stand up and I look right down at where I'm working to mark that. And then that's going to line up my fabric. You're not always going to have a stripe on your fabric. So just know that if you measure evenly from the salvage to your grain line and make sure it's the equal distance on one side as it is on the other, then you know your pattern is going to hang straight and it's going to be cut correctly as well. We talked a little bit in our fabric lesson about nap and fabrics that have a certain direction to them. So I have some little mini pattern pieces right here. Sometimes your pattern layout will have you alternate the direction of your pattern pieces in order to fit as many pattern pieces in the smallest amount of fabric as possible. And ideally, that's what you want to do. So in this case, if I wanted to nest these in here as close as possible, I could maybe mix and match one direction. I could have one upside down because look, I can get the fabrics closer together. But if you have one of those directional fabrics, it's really important that you make sure that your pattern pieces all go the same direction so that when you wear your garment, whatever texture or pile is on the fabric, it all is uniform. You will need more fabric to do that. But this is just a really good example of a layout. And you're oh, there's so much we could share here. Sometimes your pattern pieces, I'm just going to touch on this. If they're cut to utilize that stretch of the fabric or the bias, then your pattern pieces are going to actually angle a little bit differently and they're going to have different grain line markings on there. You're probably not going to use that maybe if you're brand new to sewing, but it's kind of good to have that in the back of your mind and understand because you might be wondering, I still don't understand what that word bias is. And so that has to do in relation to how the grain of the pattern, which is straight up and down, how that corresponds to the edge of the salvage. All right, well, that's a lot of information in a short amount of time, but really enjoy your patterns. I just love sewing patterns so much. They're really great. Even if you don't sew them, you can just really learn a lot by reading the information in there, and it really helps your sewing. And I guess maybe one other thing I'd like to point out is that this pattern is for knit fabrics and it has a little guide on the back for stretching your fabric. So if you do want to sew something that is a knit pattern, they're actually cut a little bit smaller and the pattern is made a little bit different than for a fabric that doesn't stretch. So just pay attention to that. And a wise instructor of mine shared this little tip with me a long time ago. There are all kinds of reference books out there for sewing, but any of these, basically dictionaries of sewing, is really probably a tool that everyone should have in their library. This is just literally an alphabetical listing of almost anything and everything you can think of for sewing. And if you get one of these and kind of read through, say you want to do collars, we would go to the C, find collars, and there's several pages of different ways that you can sew collars. Becoming familiar with a book like this really helps you grow as a sewer and just gives you an idea before you even jump into a sewing pattern. I think a tool like this really helps to simplify the sewing process. For the most part, most sewing actually is pretty simple. It's just that you're taking several steps and bringing them into one project, and that might seem overwhelming. So just familiarize yourself with some of the different steps that go into doing things like collars and pockets and whatnot, and then you'll be well on your way to many sewing successes and sewing projects. I hope this has been helpful. There's a lot to learn when it comes to a pattern, but once you understand some of the basics, you're again on your way to your new sewing project, your first sewing project, or if you're a seasoned veteran, I hope it's a good refresher for you. So join us in our next episode as we touch on some basic fitting tips and techniques to ensure your even better fitting success.